Well, hello, everyone. Hello, Armin. Hello, Pamela.
Hello, Michael.
Hey, Michael. Hey, Michael. Hi, Pam.
All right. Well, we'll get right into this, but I want to. I'll let Armin introduce our guest today. We've started a new thing here on Hollywood in History. We have some experts in their own fields that are all related to what we talk about on this podcast. And the person that we're going to be interviewing today makes the best scrambled eggs I've ever tasted in my life. And I'm looking forward to a time when I can come back and you can cook those up for me again. The homemade scrambled eggs from Pamela Steiner is highly rated. So I'm just going to turn it over to Armin here. I'll have some questions toward the end, but go ahead, Armin. Introduce our guest today.
All right, so we are very lucky to have Pamela Steiner on today. Pamela Steiner is a psychologist. In her private practice, she specialized in working with traumatized individuals. She is a senior fellow at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She has conducted conflict resolution workshops for different pairs of communities, particularly for Armenians and Turks, and for Israeli Jews and Palestinians. Her book, Collective Trauma and Armenian Genocide, Armenian, Turkish, and Azerbaijani Relations Since 1839, will be out this December. Pam, good to have you on.
Thank you.
So before we begin with my regular line of questioning, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about yourself. As I understand it, you actually come from quite an illustrious background, at least insofar as a historian is concerned. And I thought maybe you can tell our viewers about yourself.
You want me to tell them about the family?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Well, I guess the famous one is the most relevant here. It was my great-grandfather, Henry Morgenthau, who was the U.S. ambassador to the Sublime Porte in 1914 to 1916. And after him, the most famous and relevant one, in a way to me, an inspiration for me as well, was my mother's sister, Barbara Tuchman, the historian. And I would say that in different ways, certainly my mother was not famous, but who worked very hard on nuclear disarmament issues, certainly inspired me to care and notice about war peace issues.
And did that environment that you were born into lead you down the lead you down the route of studying psychology as a profession?
Well, yes, and that was because I would say that I didn't know it at the time, but I certainly had a traumatic childhood at a personal level within the family in certain ways for quite a long time. Although I didn't know it, there was no such thing in the common parlance as trauma in those days. And in addition to that, at the collective level, I watched with horror the destruction, as I saw it, of the quality of nature in the suburb that I grew up in. And that had a tremendous effect on me. I spent a lot of time in the outdoors. I rode a horse all over miles and miles of countryside that I adored, knew very well, and gradually saw it broken up into suburban housing. And it took me many years, but I eventually found out that there are better ways to provide very good housing for people and still have some respect and experience of serious amounts of nature.
And this time period that you're describing, this was when precisely?
When what? The what?
The time period that you're describing about the suburbanization, also damage to the environment. When were these issues really
Well, I was born
prominence?
in 1940, so I am 80, and you're making me admit that.
You're voluntarily revealing that information.
Shame on you, Armin.
So the period of my childhood when or later childhood when I had these traumatic experiences was late childhood, early teens, and that would coincided with when I became very aware of threats to the environment. And I think it probably also coincided with when the federal government was planning to place a highway, the Connecticut Thruway, through our property. And I remember the dispute about it when I was an early teenager. And they eventually decided, not because we had to fight over it particularly, because we didn't, but this was Eisenhower's defense highway system, part of it. And they placed it a mile away from our property, right next to the railway tracks, which was the path of least resistance, I suppose. And it ruined that whole area. And I was heartbroken about that. And I made working on transport issues my main concern for many years thereafter.
And did you immediately go into the field of psychology when you began college?
No, I majored in philosophy. I loved it, needed it. It settled a lot of questions for me. I was very lucky. I had wonderful professors, and I studied really right from early Greek philosophy right through Wittgenstein and the modern philosophers, and I learned what I wanted to learn, and it was great. And then I decided I wanted to go get a degree in political science, so I did some of that. And then my first marriage broke up. I went into therapy and I began to unravel myself. That took a long time. And then I decided to become a therapist and begin to use what I learned about psychological process and the impact of psychologically difficult experience on functioning in life and thinking about life. I decided that I wanted to try to see how I could apply that to stuck environmental issues. That was my initial interest. However, I did start a doctorate at Harvard in psychology, and I found myself very drawn to the approach of a man called Herbert Kellman, who was doing conflict resolution work with Israelis and Palestinians. So that had a much more profoundly psychological aspect to it as far as I was concerned than working on environmental issues. And also, I'm not a hard scientist, and to process the stuck environmental issues, you need some comprehension of the hard science, which I did not have. So I love the work with Herb Kellman. And that's what, then you want to hear the story about the Armenian who came to clean our rugs in our house. A wonderful guy, a local Armenian. I live next door to Belmont, where there are loads and loads of Armenians, and Watertown. And Roger Hagopian came to our house to clean our rugs. He saw a picture of my great-grandfather, on the wall. And we started to talk, and I told him about my work with Israelis and Palestinians. He told me about NASER, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, that is in Belmont, a hop, skip, and a jump from my house. And he told me I should go there and start introducing myself and learning about the Armenian-Turkish situation. So that's what happened. And that was now, probably 15 or 16 years ago. And I got hooked.
Yeah, before we go into the nitty-gritty details of the Armenian-Turkish imbroglio, if you will, I was actually wanting to ask if you could tell us briefly, what was the state of psychology at the time that you were studying it? You mentioned Herbert Kellman, and was there a particular methodology that you decided to adopt when, I suppose, you went into you opened your own private practice before you started taking part in these conflict resolution cases with Israelis, Palestinians, and...
No, it was all contemporaneous. I took a very long time to do my doctoral degree. And I did, at the same time I was studying for that, I also did a lot of clinical training. So I did some training, my first training in trauma psychology and group psychology. And I started my private practice then. And then when I got the degree, I could get licensed. I guess I must have started my private practice with other therapists so I could work under them, because I didn't open up a private practice till I got licensed.
And was trauma a subject which you came across immediately during your
No,
time as a doctorate student? Or
that's a really good question, because it really wasn't in the air. And I had already been in practice for a little while. And trauma suddenly, it must have gradually been happening. I don't remember the date of Judith Herman's book, which was the classic on the traumatic experience that was in common between both Vietnam veterans and women who were victims of sexual abuse. But that opened up a great deal in the psychological field, and trauma has become more and more important as the paradigm through which to understand a very great deal of human suffering that is called psychological. So it was around then.
And of course, we use that word so frequently that perhaps we don't reflect on its meaning. I was wondering, perhaps it may be a stupid question, but could you provide us a definition of trauma as opposed to maybe something else that may leave an emotional mark on human beings? What makes it such a this subject of studies and research that we read?
Well, traumatic experience is immensely common. It's couldn't be more common, really. It's not recognized as such. Lots of people who've been traumatized never get any help. So what trauma is to experience something really horrible that makes you feel really, really awful. That's the way, the core of it. You're being hurt in some way and threatened with great hurt, and you may experience it. You probably do. And what it does is it has major effects on you psychologically as well as physically and so on. There's the brain reacts automatically in a certain way. It goes into what is called fight, flight, or freeze. People automatically, when they're badly threatened, either try to run away from it first. If they can't run away, they try to fight it to protect themselves. It's all about protection in the face of threat. And if they can't fight or flee, they curl up, metaphorically or for real, and go completely quiet. They freeze. And some people literally freeze in the face of a traumatic threat, such as a parent standing by a pond, seeing their child drowning in the water, unable to swim, and they want to run in and help them, and they freeze. They cannot. That is not uncommon. And the situation of freeze affects your temperature. Your body gets cold. And when you work with people who've had severe trauma, their bodies will often get cold. So the essence of trauma is this terrible experience, which has terrible after effects also, such as nightmares, thoughts about the trauma going through your mind over and over, and you can't escape them. And you also tend to reorganize your understanding of the world according to the trauma. So if you were really, really scared, you will remain scared to a greater or lesser degree if you do not process and get some healing from that processing of the trauma. I'll give you a simple example. When I was in college, my parents got me a car in my last year of college, And it turned out the manufacturer took it off the road, but only after, because of its lack of safety, well after I had an accident. I was going around a curve and the car turned over a couple times and I broke my neck. Luckily, by 1/25th of an inch, I was not paralyzed from the neck down, but I get quite anxious still with certain moves when I'm driving or someone else drives, for example. So that was a traumatic experience. Now, there are many different kinds of traumas, Armin and Michael. You can divide them according to whether they're shock traumas, like a car accident or 9/11, or being held up on the street all of a sudden when you're walking peacefully along, or they're not very shocking traumas like slow descent into starvation or slow descent into a bad illness, or being increasingly badly verbally abused by a parent, and then there are some that are a mix of both. There are plenty of them that are a mix of both kinds of trauma. Then is another typology where you divide traumas into humanly caused or ones caused by nature. And so you could say that an earthquake is a natural trauma, whereas genocide is a humanly caused trauma.
Thank you. That actually leads to the question I was going to ask next, and this I think would also be a very good segue into your book as well. Does trauma function, if that's the correct word, or at the very least differ how it impacts one on an individual as opposed to the collective level?
Well, First, let me say that trauma has some individuals with trauma have all had some similar experience and all have had some different experience, because human beings have two big factors, nature and nurture, genes and otherwise. We all have the same brains, but we all have different brains as well. We all have some similar experiences growing, and we have some different ones. So human beings react the same and differently to the same traumatic experience. Collectivities are groups of large numbers of people, obviously, and it's a kind of adding up of a common sense of what happened or what is happening or what is threatening. But the impact of trauma on collectivities is also on its institutions. You know, it destroys whole cities. Look what's happening in Karabakh. It destroys towns. It kills people in great numbers. It destroys medical services. People start starving in numbers. And this has a major impact on how the group understands itself. So it's analogous to human responses.
Yes, and I think that, again, serves as a very good place to allow us to pivot to your book, which is all about, as its title suggests, collective trauma and its impact on those who survived the Armenian Genocide of 1915. So I, for one, am very excited to see this book finally appearing in press, as I'm sure you are too, Pam. And before anyone accuses me of bias, in the interest of full disclosure, I was your research assistant on this project, and that's something which I gladly confess to. And
I have to jump in and say you were the very best possible research assistant plus that anyone could ever have had. I could not have written this book without your incredible help, and I will always be grateful.
I second that.
Thank you.
What makes you say that, Michael?
Because he's the one who's brought me as far as I've come in my project. So he's my research assistant or my guide. Throws books at me, takes me to Europe, into archives, etc. Introduces me to people like you, incredible people. So.
Right? Armin's a great, great guy. And I met him through another great guy. You want to just mention him, Armin?
Of course, he was mentioned, I think, in one of our earlier episodes with when it was just between Michael and I, and that was, of course, my boss at my law office, Vargas Ryan. And I can tell the story, but you know, how I even met you and.
Yes, you do that. Yes.
Yeah. So if I recall correctly, in January 2015, Vargas went to Massachusetts to on legal business. He's an attorney. And while he was there, he also attended a talk you were giving at Framingham, I believe.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. And he came back, of course, with many good words and good impressions. This was something which Vargas was also very interested in. He was a survivor of or he was the son of a survivor of the Armenian Genocide. His father was born in a small little town called Isparta, and he ended up in Ethiopia after the genocide, and that's where Vargas was born. And I was going to go do research at Harvard's research library I think it was in March of that year, and I just decided to send you an email just because of the fact that Vargas had mentioned you to me, and that's how ultimately you invited me to lunch at your place in Cambridge, and I thought you know, that was an interesting way of meeting a person and, you know, starting a relationship.
That's right.
Right. So let's actually get to the topic of the book. Pam, let me first ask you, why did you decide to write this book?
Right. I decided to write it because I had worked quite many years on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then I had done a few years of learning and work with Armenians and Turks. And I deeply believe in the conflict resolution approach to resolving conflict, but it's not enough, and it's not good enough either yet. But I found that it was really very disappointing in its achievements in these two conflicts. And I tried to think what was missing. And what seemed to me to be missing was an understanding of what lay at the root of what made people fight with each other, a good part of it, what, at least at the psychological level, of what made them fight and keep fighting over and over. Now, having said that, I want to make it very clear quickly that the conflict resolution approach is the alternative to communities hating each other ad infinitum. However, it cannot possibly work when the use of military power by one party over another is running the show. And so I'm afraid that I don't think much of anything will really work until we have international compliance measures that are serious. And furthermore, that international courts function much more muscularly than they do now, so that unrepentant perpetrators can go and be held responsible. So I really wrote the book to fill in something that I felt was deeply missing from the understanding by historians, diplomats, military people, and ordinary citizens, that was missing from the understanding of what propels conflict and what keeps it going. So there's no way in which I think my understanding as expressed in this book is a substitute for any of those things, but it is an addition to them, to all of the other theories of conflict and approaches to conflict resolution. But it is entirely left out now. all of these historians and diplomats and analysts and so on will give lip service to it. I mean, they'll call something a trauma, indeed, and they have a general idea, of course, what it means. We all do. But they don't have a particular grasp of the effect of it on either individuals or large groups of people, in my opinion.
Right, and as you just said, your book approaches the study of the Armenian Genocide from a rather uncommon lens. As historians, or at least a historian in training, we're much more familiar with working in archives and examining many types of sources to ask different questions from our historical subjects. How do you feel your approach contributes to our understanding of this pivotal moment in the history of Armenians?
Well, oh God, there's so much to say there. But to begin with, it's extremely important that the perpetrator be kept under control. If a perpetrator will not acknowledge the crimes that they committed, they do need to be held accountable by something bigger than they are. But I think if they are, and if they admit it, being forced to, it makes some difference to the healing of the victim group, but it doesn't do that much. It helps, but it doesn't heal completely by any means. And my example for this is the Jewish people. I'm a Jew, and as far as I'm concerned, the Israeli treatment of Palestinians overall has been one that is tremendously overreactive and over-punishing. And they have, as somebody has said, the victims have victimized another group. And it's a form of transmitted trauma from one party to another, the effect of it. And the thing is that trauma makes people, if they're not healed or processed it, it makes them want to hurt back. We have, all of us, an impulse for vengeance. And if you don't have some very strong moral fiber inside of you against taking it, or you rationalize and give yourself a reason for taking it out on a being that is less powerful than you, you may do it with the power you have. And that's unacceptable. You cannot, that's not based on law, that's based on power and the impulse for vengeance. And that's a bad thing, totally bad thing. So, but in a lawless society, people are going to just do what it takes to defend themselves. And unfortunately, we don't have enough international law that functions well enough, and international courts, as I said, or in international peacekeeping forces. So make me be more specific, Armin, please.
Sure. I suppose what I was trying to drive at was how does approaching the subject of the Armenian Genocide and this narrative that you construct in your book by looking at events in the Ottoman Empire and also in the Russian Empire, where there was also a very significant Armenian population, and bringing it to about the present day, right? What does psychology help us better understand in a way that perhaps history or political science is not as well prepared to, or maybe not well prepared, but
right. The effects, the symptoms of trauma experience, whether they're at the level of the individual or the collective level, and I go through a lot of both in my book, are present, and that's what's left out of these other disciplines. But in the book, I do try to link it to the history. I first try to show all the different collective traumas that there were between the two groups, because there were some one at least imposed by Armenians on the Azeris, not on the Turks. And I try also to show, and this is to me very important, that but in both in the South Caucasus, where the Armenians and Azerbaijanis are fighting now, 100 years ago, each of those groups very much wanted the same thing. They wanted a right to live their lives expressing their identities in peace. And they each wanted some autonomy within the Russian Empire, as it was before the Russians were taken over by the Soviets and dropped out of the war. And that's before the Turks entered the South Caucasus in order to gain more territory, if possible, without any Armenians in it, or at least without any Armenian community strength in it. So, as well as showing the negative impacts of traumatic experience historically, I also spend a certain amount of time showing the commonalities in aims the two groups had for their futures as peoples. And I mention certain individuals who had a better perception of what could be that was positive between them. And I thought to myself, well, what really makes sense would be to be able to free themselves from either Russian control or Turkish control, because the two empires that are no longer in existence are, have been taken over by Russians and Turks who continue to push the people in the South Caucasus around. But it seems to me that if the people in the South Caucasus got together, as they once briefly did in 1918, and formed a greater union among themselves, they could do quite a lot. Now, I know in a way that sounds pie in the sky, but it is also an old idea. And I personally would advocate for a process going forward in which, and this is my last chapter of the book, I spend a lot of time describing large group events at the unofficial level of thoughtful individuals who would like peace in both societies to be carefully conducted. Now, this is impossible in Azerbaijan because you can't speak openly safely at the moment, but they might make a space for it. And I don't know how popular it would be in Armenia either. I don't know how able people in Armenia are today to question anything about the government's stance and the mobilization for survival, which is completely understandable. But we have to continue to go on thinking, and it seems to me that there are other possibilities.
Could we maybe just backtrack a little bit to the subject of the genocide? When we had Ron Sunni on our show about a week ago, he made a very interesting remark when he was talking about his book that appeared in 2015, The History on the Armenian Genocide, which was titled They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else. And what he was trying to do in his book was not so much, of course, not so much, but he was, of course, not trying to justify what the Committee of Union and Progress leadership did in 1915 as to understand why they did it, why they carried out the Armenian Genocide. And I thought one of your chapters in your book approaches this subject in a way which I don't think many historians on the Armenian Genocide have done it, in the way that you look at the personal lives of these very men who implemented the genocide. Talat, who was the Ottoman interior minister and then the Grand Vizier during the war, Enver Pasha, who was the war minister, Dr. Nazim, who was an ideologue of the Committee of Union and Progress. Why did you feel that focusing on their backgrounds was important and worthy of including within your larger narrative of your book?
Okay, well, because I was fascinated to find out that each of these 5 men had experienced some major trauma in relation to the decline or disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and that they were furious about it. They cared tremendously about preserving the empire. And I also, as Armin knows, give a certain amount of credibility to the idea that they were very unwilling to give up their high status as Ottomans. And that I think that, but that's a very grown-up pursuit. Young people think less of status in that way. And these people just wanted vengeance after their traumas, or sometime. They each experienced trauma at a different age in their lives. So, but the most out front about the desire for vengeance was Ismail Enver, who was the Minister of War, and he presided over the retaking of Edirne, right?
He was definitely one of the main military commanders in 1913. Mm-hmm.
Right.
The Second Balkan War.
Second Balkan War. And he gave a speech about the Christian slaves that, he spoke in the most derogatory terms and with contempt over the Christians that who had dared to take his land and that he could take it back from them. And he was for vengeance, vengeance, vengeance. He wrote that in a letter to his fiancée. So, but I think they were all shaped by their traumatic experience.
And
of course, completely unaware of it as such, unaware of the impulse that resulted from it for vengeance. Sorry, yeah.
And of course, the denial that the Turkish state has actively promoted ever really since its founding in 1923 carries this outsized effect we're now seeing in political matters relating to the domestic population of Turkey today, and also as we're seeing with Turkey's support of Azerbaijan during this conflict, is being interpreted by many Armenians as almost a continuation of the genocide. And hence, to your point of how this kind of trauma, having not been properly reconciled, rears its head even years now, almost more than a century since the commission of the genocide.
But let me say, if I said this already, please stop me. But, Turkey denies the genocide. They spew nasty things about Armenians. I mean, they say horrible things about Armenians. They show contempt and so on. Well, and they're coming with weapons into the South Caucasus. They did their best to prevent the formation of an Armenian state. It was a miracle that the Armenians were able to establish a republic in 1918. And the Turks have never been happy about it, and they still talk about purifying the region for themselves, for Muslims. So I ask you as an analogy to imagine, what if Germany had not been forced, did I mention this already? Been forced
I don't think so.
to admit they committed the crimes of the genocide. What if they had continued to deny it? Would Jews feel safe if Germans were bringing weapons into the Middle East anywhere near them? I mean, if you don't disavow a war aim, which was to empty the South Caucasus of Armenians, seems to me that it would be extremely frightening and threatening.
And this also brings up another question that I wanted to ask, and this was inspired by some of these articles and op-eds that I've been reading in the news over the last 2-3 weeks since this war began. In the early 1990s, there was common reference to ancient hatreds being the cause of these very violent scenes in places like in Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia was breaking up apart as a state, as well as in Nagorno-Karabakh. And historians, especially today and in past years, have always cautioned us to avoid using that phrase. I thought, is it possible to maybe break down it itself, or is there something a little bit more to it when we look at it when we look at the history of the last 100 years? And of course, we can look at, let's say, economic and structural reasons as trying to explain why the violence, for example, in Yugoslavia assumed the forms that it did 25, 30 years ago. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, can we link trauma to traumatic events from a century ago to what is taking place now, and be able to not necessarily attribute it to ancient hatred, but unreconciled emotions and fears that are still alive to this day? I think we've been talking about in length at this point, but if we can elaborate on it.
I can't. I mean, I think you said it. You know, I do. I mean, I don't know that situation intimately at all, but it certainly sounds like that. The less you get to know people, the more you mistrust, you know, and they say bad things about you, the more you mistrust them, of course, and they threaten you, and that produces very bad feeling and continued threats. And it's somehow, you know, we haven't figured this one out in terms of how we bring up children. So there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can ask a question that is somewhat related to it. Can you describe, or coming from the perspective of psychologists, can trauma be passed down from one generation to another on a collective level?
I would call it cultural transmission. It goes individual to individual, but it also gets into the culture. So it will be culturally transmitted in literature and in politics, you know, in all parts of life. It's always there. It pervades everything. Everything has that aspect.
Right. As you mentioned, those mediums can be the perfect ways of disseminating certain thoughts or feelings, and
yeah, and that conditions people to think in a certain way. When you're young, you take it from the elders who you respect, your parents and people in your community, and if that's what they teach you, you pick it up. Now, there is some clarity, which I'm not up to speed on, about physiological transmission, genetic transmission. And I gather it has some reality to it. I'm not up to speed.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought maybe the last question that I can ask you about your book was, what would you say were the greatest challenges that you encountered when researching and writing it?
Oh boy. What do you think?
Well, I mean, for me, it was a very informative experience in looking back at even sources that I may have looked at again, and looking at them from your vantage point. And, you know, as trained, you know, we both, of course, are trained in different professions, and it's always interesting how the perspective of someone else can bring an entirely different understanding of a firsthand memoir, let's say, or how it sometimes even upends what you thought you may have known about a subject that you consider yourself even an expert on. For me, I felt like I was a little bit on familiar ground because it is the subject area that I study on, but I suppose I was wanting to ask you to see, did anything come as a surprise to you, or?
Oh, yes. Well, yes. I mean, listen, I can tell you I can't tell you the hardest thing, but I can tell you a bunch of hardest things, or very hard things. I mean, first of all, to find my way around in this history was not easy. I mean, I had more or less not even heard of the South Caucasus or Transcaucasia. I have to confess. So that was hard. It was also hard to, since I decided that the history was incredibly important to this whole thing, I had a hard time writing each chapter, each history chapter, to show what the essence of the traumatic experience of that chapter was. That was very, very hard. And I had to go over and over each chapter and keep asking myself, what is the core of the trauma here? What am I really trying to convey? And keep my eye on that all the time. And then in the last chapter, that was really, I mean, it was the concept of the book slowly emerged. The 4 parts of the book, that was not easy at all, but it emerged and it made great sense to me once I had done it. The introductory part, which includes the chapters about trauma, the second part, which is the Armenian-Turkish relationship, and the third part, which is the Armenian-Azerbaijani plus Turkey's relationship, and Russia, of course, comes into it. And the fourth part is the analysis, the psychological analysis, and bringing us to some extent up to date. And the last chapter is about processes for dealing, the issues and processes for dealing with such a history. And to organize that chapter was really hard. It was very, very painful. So, you know, it was all hard. It was very hard, but I'm happy I did it.
Yeah, I suppose one question I also do have is related to your understanding of, I think you said that psychoanalysis is still forms the bedrock of our understanding of human beings and especially of trauma. Is that correct?
Yep.
Do you feel that whenever you were reading sources, primary sources, or reading these accounts on the Armenian Genocide, you could maybe winkle out the fears or the emotions and perhaps extrapolate the thinking and the kind of emotional environment that the historical characters that you are writing about and getting to their minds? Or if I'm not sure if that's making sense, but at the very least, did it become coherent to you?
Yeah, I had to, Armin, because I don't know all the languages that you know. I didn't go into original sources. I didn't read a lot of the memoirs, and I doubt if people talked much about their emotions in them anyway. So I had to kind of propose that people probably thought this and that or felt this and that. I did. And try to impose, as it were, some generalizable motivations, common motivations. And I did look for, well, I don't know as I looked for them, but if I got a hint of them, I probably seized on them to some extent. I tried very hard not to distort anything. I really did. I tried to be absolutely fair-minded throughout.
And this is my last question. And what would you like your readers to come out after having read this book? Is there an ideal hope of lessons they may learn or something they may be able to draw from after reading this?
I would like people to become aware of how difficult it is to live together with other people that you think you don't like, but that it's absolutely essential, and and to get over kidding ourselves that we can go on being so destructive to each other and have a livable planet anymore. Those days are over with. And if we want to conserve our limited resources and have any kind of quality of life, we've got to make major changes fast. And we have to start recognizing common humanity in us all and agree to a much better international system. I would love that.
That would be lovely. Michael, do you have any questions? I have just the one on Solomon Tehlirian, but I don't want it to appear as if we're going off on a tangent or coming out of left field.
Ask your Solomon Tehlirian question, then I have about maybe three questions, maybe four.
So,
or five, we'll see.
So, Pam, if you've been watching these episodes, almost always they circle back around the story of Solomon Tehlirian. And also, I should say that for those of you who are new to this channel and are watching this now, I'd ask you to go back and watch some of the earlier episodes to find out why Michael and I are appearing on this show called Hollywood in History. But based on what you, Pam, based on what you have read and learned about Solomon Tehlirian, is there a way that you can, and this is again a question I always like to ask historians or people who have, or maybe they come at it from different specialties, but as a psychologist, how would you understand him and his actions?
How would I understand his actions?
Or describe them or contextualize them?
I would say that he was in an absolute rage of agony at the injustice and the wrongs. And because Talat wasn't being punished, he was going to do it. And Talat had it coming to him. And it was too bad that there wasn't law to take over. But he was enacting righteous vengeance, in my view. Understandable. I mean, I don't think he was crazy myself. Surely everybody's mind would be disturbed after being through that. But, that's...
All right. Michael, if you...
Wow, I'm actually glad you asked that question, Armin, because that answer just confirms everything that the conclusions I've come to. Now, I'm not a historian. I don't have a PhD or even an MA in history, but I feel like I've gotten close to the equivalent of that kind of education, just specifically on Solomon Tehlirian. And having read his memoir and knowing his family and doing this research into some, prime resources, the guy was just primary resources. The guy was just doing the right thing because nobody else would. And even in the trial and the transcript, he was psychoanalyzed by at least three different clinicians, and all of them said, no, he's in his right mind. He does not show the signs of somebody who's deranged or psychotic. He was driven by justice. So when you said it was a righteous vengeance or a righteous rage, it was, I like that answer. All right. So a couple quick questions. Can I
just say something quickly?
Yes.
One of the thing is with trauma, one of the ways to heal is to have a release of the fight or flight. I had a client once who had been, her boyfriend had attempted to strangle her a couple times, and she was terrified and had managed to get away from him, but she was still very traumatized. And in my office, she was describing it one time, and she took off after she told me about it. She ran out of the office, never came back again. She was exercising the flight. She was not able to exercise to get away from him years and years before. And a few years after that, she called me up to thank me. She said she was happily married. That had healed her.
It was interesting that you mentioned a lot of the memoirs. Likely people didn't necessarily talk about how they felt to get an assessment of their psychological state. But we have Solomon's memoirs about to come out. Well, it's almost done being translated. And he does the night after he assassinated Talat, he describes sitting in the jail cell and describing freedom. Like, it's this perfectly cinematic irony that he was in bondage to this task, and it was the fight task. Like, I've got to fight this guy. He's getting away. He can't get away with it. And he represented all of Armenia. And then he succeeds, and he's sitting in a jail cell, locked up, where he's supposed to be in bondage, and he's free. He describes it for the first time, literally describes wandering the earth. There's so many possibilities out there. There's this girl I'm in love with that I want to marry. I want to have a family. It was like the first time he could even think about those things.
That's wonderful.
All right. So last time we saw each other was a little over a year ago. And I don't believe in coincidences. I just can't believe, because we planned our trip and your trip had already been planned. And here we end up in the same city where your great-grandfather had worked for a couple of years, and you're there for a very specific event. Can you explain why you were in Istanbul last summer?
And I had made up my mind to go only in the last couple weeks before I took the trip. I was invited to the wedding of one of my earlier research assistants before Armin, a Turkish doctoral student at Harvard. And she invited me to her wedding, and she was a lovely young woman, and I was delighted to be able to go.
And then once they found you were coming, did they have set up something special for you, for some other people there of significance?
No, but I know they couldn't have been nicer to me. No, they were lovely. But I went to the Hrant Dink Memorial Museum, fantastic, wonderful memorial museum. And I also visited Hassan Jamal, who was the grandson of one of the three, what I call architects of the Armenian Genocide. And Hassan Jamal is somebody I had met years before. He had been to Armenia. He had laid flowers at the Armenian Genocide Memorial. And he wrote a book called 1915 Armenian Genocide, and it was a bestseller in Turkey. So I was invited to his home and had a lovely time there.
So this is the grandson of one of the architects.
I know. Isn't it amazing?
All right. We didn't talk much about your great-grandfather, so I just want to ask a few quick questions.
Okay.
So you're a great-granddaughter. How many great-grandchildren are there that you know of? I mean, from Henry Morgenthau?
Probably quite a lot, probably. I mean, there are 10 in my immediate family. My mother and her two sisters, among them, had 10 children.
I just find it fascinating that you are this book you've written, and you said it's only been in the past 15 years or so that you focused in on this. It's like you have a connection with your great-grandfather, who you probably never knew.
I did meet him.
Oh, okay.
I did twice, or once. No, I think once, maybe just once. And he gave me a present that I'll never forget.
What was it?
What was it? Yeah.
What was it? It was a Japanese doll. It was about 2 feet tall. It was in a glass sort of showcase thing, but it was about 6 inches wide, and she was dressed beautifully in silk, traditional Japanese clothes. And I was much too young. I was given it when I was 2 or 3 years old. And I proceeded it was put away in a closet till I was older, I suppose, but my parents forgot about it, and I pulled it out of the closet and pulled it apart.
You just played with it, right?
I did.
So your great-grandfather knew Talat Pasha personally. I suppose their offices were down the hall from each other or on the same compound in the Sublime Porte. From him, and he wrote his memoir or his journal that is available. From your words, what were his impressions of Talat?
Oh, he thought Talat was a very remarkable person, a very strong character, charismatic, pretty ruthless, full of energy.
Was he frustrated with the United States? I mean, he would report back
Yes, he was, because my great-grandfather was frustrated, and so was Talat, because Talat wanted the information about the insurance policies for the Armenians they killed. And the insurance, somehow they were not given up to him. So he was frustrated with the United States. And my great-grandfather was frustrated as well with the failure of the country to come and do more. He was a lone voice.
That actually brings me to today's events. There are those in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh who are surrounded by countries that some of their allies are enemies of the United States, and some of their enemies are allies of the United States, and the United States is this great world power. And do you think there's anything the United States can do in this situation?
Under Mr. Trump? The furthest he keeps away from it, the better. You know.
Well, Professor Sunni said, well, he's crazy enough. He might be the only one that could do something.
I think he said I think he said if we were on a different planet, maybe.
That's right. He said that would be wonderful, but on a different world it would happen.
Different world, yeah.
All right. I want to respect your time, but one thing we could go in that direction, but we're over an hour now. Last thing, and this is something we ask of everyone, since normally we do spend more time on this podcast talking about movies and Hollywood because it's Hollywood in history. But as we're interviewing historians and experts like yourself, we at least want to get a movie recommendation from you. It doesn't have to be related to history or anything. A favorite movie, or we're movie lovers, and we've had some recommendations of films we haven't seen. Do you recommend a movie for Armin and I to watch?
Oh boy, I can't off the top of my head. I'd have to go look at my list. I have some old movies that I love, but no, I have to go and look it up. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, maybe I'll have Armin reach out to you and
sure. I'd love to tell him. I'll send him a list.
Great.
I love movies too and love them.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. And we're going to post this and we'll let you know when it's up. Thank you.
Thank you too. Bye-bye. Nice to see you.
Bye.
Good to see you again.